When the sphere fell near Buga, Colombia in 2025, it was not accompanied by fire, sound or explanation. It was silent, intact and precise. No impact crater, no debris. Just an object, sealed, coated and unmistakably deliberate. Analysts called it anomalous. Engineers called it unclassifiable. But for those who understood the deeper architectures of field and form, its arrival was not a mystery. It was a signal. The sphere did not emerge from nowhere. It completed a path. Its surface bore no inscription, yet encoded geometry. Its structure offered no technology, yet demonstrated method. And most critically, its motion was not ballistic, it was patterned. It arrived not as a fragment of the future, but as a proof from the past. To understand why it returned, we must ask where it began. And to find its origin, we do not look to factories or satellites. We look beneath the earth, to a mound in Tabasco, Mexico, where in 1969 a hidden structure was detected. Basalt blocks magnetized, aligned and arranged in triadic form. A structure that even now radiates a stable directional field. That structure has been forgotten. The data exists, but the meaning has not been traced. It lies buried not only in soil, but in the assumptions of modern thought, that ancient people could not manipulate force, could not shape fields, could not encode knowledge in space. But they could, and they did. What they built beneath Mound A2 is not just archaeology, it is function. And when understood in its full configuration, it reveals something extraordinary. The Buga sphere is not an alien artifact. It is a returning one, launched in antiquity, guided by geometry, preserved by time, and retrieved by field. It is the final element in a system whose components span millennia: structure, vector, calendar, return. What follows is not speculation, it is a reconstruction. From magnetized stone to orbital re-entry, from buried corner to recovered sphere, we trace the logic of a closed causal system, one that was built, launched, and now, unmistakably, complete. In 1969, at the Olmec site of Venta in Tabasco, Mexico, a team of researchers carried out a magnetic survey of a major ceremonial platform known as Mound A2. The project was led by geophysicist Frank Morrison and archaeologist R.F. Heiser, and employed a proton precession magnetometer to scan the surface of the mound with a meter-by-meter grid. The goal was not excavation, but detection, to identify subsurface features through their influence on the Earth's magnetic field. What they found exceeded all expectations. The results revealed a sharply defined, localized magnetic anomaly near the center of the mound's summit. This was not a minor irregularity or a diffuse signal. It was a concentrated, coherent field disturbance registering several hundred nanoteslas above the ambient level. The field exhibited a dipolar character with a clear axis of orientation and a spatial coherence that ruled out random variation or natural mineral dispersion. The anomaly's edges were distinct, its shape was bounded. The magnitude was strong. Modeling indicated that the source of the field lay approximately 4 to 5 meters beneath the surface. Based on field strength and geometry, Morrison and Heiser proposed that the source was a buried structure composed of large basalt blocks, arranged in a three-dimensional right angle, one forming a horizontal base and two rising vertically at 90 degrees along adjacent edges. The resulting configuration resembled a corner in space, orthogonal, oriented, and internally coherent. This interpretation was not speculative. It was grounded in measurable data and supported by physical modeling. The researchers concluded that the anomaly was most likely caused by massive stone elements with remnant magnetization, rocks that retained a permanent magnetic orientation acquired during their formation. The key material in question was basalt, known to be rich in iron-bearing minerals and capable of sustaining a stable magnetic field over time. Crucially, the basalt at Venta did not originate locally. It was transported from the Tuxtla Mountains, some 80 miles to the west, requiring deliberate quarrying, logistical coordination, and significant physical effort. That effort was not incidental. It was directed toward a particular goal: to move a specific kind of stone from a specific location and embed it within a specific configuration at the heart of a central mound. The implications are straightforward. The material was magnetically responsive. The configuration was structured. The orientation was preserved, and the field it generated remained detectable and directional. even centuries later beneath meters of earth. No natural process explains this combination. It was not the result of random collapse nor a byproduct of sediment layering. It was not incidental, it was intentional. And yet, after the publication of the findings in Science in 1970, no further investigation followed. The site was not excavated, the structure was not confirmed. Interest drifted elsewhere, and the anomaly faded into the background of archaeological discourse. In the decades that followed, research at Venta focused on iconography, settlement patterns, and elite burial practices. The southern half of the ancient city was paved over for an oil refinery, and the most precise magnetic anomaly ever recorded at a Mesoamerican site remained buried, unstudied, and unexplained. Still, the data remains. It is not ambiguous. It describes in clear physical terms a dense, internally magnetized body beneath the earth. It defines its location, its orientation, and its field. It demonstrates that something beneath Mound A2 was designed to hold its position, resist movement, and generate a stable, structured magnetic signature across time. This is the physical foundation of the problem. A massive, carefully transported material arranged in a geometrically precise configuration, preserved beneath a central ceremonial mound, still emitting a measurable magnetic field. Not aesthetic, not symbolic, not accidental. A structure with alignment, mass, and coherence. A structure that does something. And it is from that data that interpretation must begin. To build what lies beneath Mound A2, the people of Venta had to possess very specific forms of knowledge. First, they had to know the difference between stones, not merely in shape or durability, but in physical properties. They had to recognize that some basalt carried an invisible quality, a force that could act on metal, disturb orientation, or influence behavior without touch. They had to know how to identify this property in the raw material itself, by weight, texture, reaction, or some repeated experiment that revealed the stone's magnetic potential. That recognition alone places them in a domain of observation not often credited to early civilizations, an empirical engagement with force at a distance. But beyond the material, they also had to understand alignment. Remnant magnetism is directional. It resides in the internal vector of the stone's magnetic moment. If placed arbitrarily, the stone's fields would cancel or drift. But at Venta, the magnetic anomaly is not chaotic. It is coherent and dipolar, which means the builders had to orient each block intentionally, fixing each stone's direction in relation to the others. This implies a spatial literacy that goes beyond symbolic geometry. It suggests a working grasp of vector orientation and of how to preserve that orientation in mass. Finally, they had to understand structure. A single stone can generate a field, but it is only when three are placed in orthogonal relation that the field becomes a space, one with boundaries, directions, and behavior. They had to know that it wasn't enough to select the right material or align one axis. They had to build a configuration, one that stabilized itself through geometry and mass, and one that would persist across centuries. That knowledge is not symbolic or decorative, it is mechanical, and they possessed it. From that knowledge, we can begin to deduce purpose. The act of transporting magnetized basalt 80 miles and burying it beneath an engineered mound is not explained by general ritual. Ritual does not require directional magnetism. It does not require triadic structure. It does not require orthogonality or physical field coherence. The configuration, the flat base with two rising orthogonal walls, forms a stable triad in space. In field terms, this defines a volume where magnetic vectors intersect, oppose, and reinforce. Within that space, the magnetic field is not ambient, it is active. It contains structure, zones of cancellation, areas of increased intensity, gradients of directional force. Any object placed within this space, particularly one responsive to magnetism, would behave differently depending on its position and orientation. The field is not random background, it is a designed environment. So we ask, what could they do with what they had built? They could first and most directly observe the behavior of magnetically responsive objects within the field. By moving flakes of iron-rich sand, polished tools, or organic materials across the field's surface, they could track lines of force, sense areas of resistance or flow, and begin to map the invisible structure that surrounded them. This alone constitutes a form of experimental physics, an early science of force developed not through writing or theory, but through construction and interaction. Second, they could create a field that was replicable. Because the structure was stable and preserved, it could be returned to again and again. It became a kind of calibrated environment, one where the same behavior would be observable at different times. That stability made it an instrument. It enabled teaching, testing, and the accumulation of knowledge through experience. It turned field behavior into memory. And third, it allowed them to encode knowledge in space. The field itself became a message, not a symbolic code to be deciphered, but a physical condition to be entered. Anyone who stepped into that field and interacted with it could learn the same things the builders had. They had constructed not just a field, but a transmission system, one that taught through alignment, interaction, and repetition. In modern terms, we would call this a field engine, an architectural apparatus that generates a stable force environment. But for its builders, it was likely more than that. It was a space of convergence, of stone, field, and behavior. A device built to preserve knowledge not as abstraction, but as structured experience. And that is the lesson. When ancient builders chose the hardest materials, transported them across long distances, aligned them with precision, and preserved their configuration beneath layers of protective mass, they were not engaged in art. They were engaged in memory. Every decision they made imposed cost, and every cost clarifies intent. What they left us was not a ruin. It was a message written in field, mass, and relation, waiting, still coherent beneath the surface. Not hidden for the sake of secrecy, but buried for the sake of time. The object that fell near Buga, Colombia in 2025, intact, layered, sealed and wrapped in a heat-resistant black coating, was quickly labelled anomalous. It bore no signs of combustion or impact trauma, showed no identifying marks or serial codes, and exhibited a structural design that did not conform to modern satellite components or aerospace fragments. But the object did conform to something else. It was spherical, smooth, metallic, and inertially stable. It matched not the logic of modern rocketry, but the deeper, older logic of terrestrial geometry. The cultures of Mesoamerica, Olmec, Maya, Aztec, are well known for their obsession with spheres, more specifically with the dynamics of spherical motion. The sacred ball game, played on precisely leveled courts with architecturally constrained bounds, reflects a deep understanding of how objects move in space when guided by force and form. The ball was not merely an object of play or ritual, it was a vector. It responded to angle, to torque, to gravity. It stored energy and released it, and most importantly, it could be launched, not as a projectile, but as a configured body acted upon by structured force. Its purpose was not passive observation. It was to carry something, information, geometry, alignment into space and return. It was not designed to transmit continuously like a satellite, nor to burn like a meteor. It was made to endure and complete a circuit, from Earth to sky and back again. Its form reflects that purpose. A sphere is the only shape that ensures uniform drag and consistent orientation under atmospheric re-entry. It requires no fins, no gimbals, no stabilizing jets. When acted upon by force, especially magnetic or impulse-driven force, it reacts cleanly, predictably, symmetrically. It is the perfect carrier for a magnetic launch. The method of launch becomes visible once we return to Venta and what it structurally provides. A triadic arrangement of magnetically aligned basalt blocks is not merely symbolic, it generates a coherent field. If an object containing a temporary or triggered magnetic charge were introduced into that environment and aligned with the dominant vectors, it would be subject to vector repulsion. A sudden discharge from within the object, a pulse of electromagnetic energy, piezoelectric release, or chemical reaction, could generate a directional push. If timed with the configuration of the field and with the sphere's internal vector aligned opposite to the field orientation, it could experience a Lorentz-type force sufficient to lift it clear of the structure. Not into orbit as modern rockets do through sustained thrust, but through impulse acceleration. The principle behind railguns and coil guns applied with field rather than wire. The sphere's objectivity lies in its construction. It is sealed, internally isolated from atmospheric or thermal influence. It is coated to absorb and dissipate the heat of re-entry while minimizing reflectivity. And it is constructed to endure, not explode. It is not a weapon, it is a capsule. More specifically, a time capsule. Its return was not random, it was engineered. The sphere was launched not in modern times but in antiquity by the Olmecs. This is not speculation. It is the only conclusion consistent with the continuity of material, method and structure. The same civilization that transported magnetized basalt across 80 miles, aligned it with precision and buried it beneath an engineered mound, had the capacity to construct a directional field engine. That structure beneath Mound A2 is not decorative, it is functional. And its function was interaction, with matter, with magnetism, and ultimately with motion. Into that field they introduced a sphere, small, sealed, inertially stable, and internally charged. They understood that within a triadic vector environment, alignment could generate movement. They did not need to invent combustion. They needed to recognize structure. With mass fixed, orientation set, and internal charge triggered, the launch was not explosive. It was field-driven. The sphere lifted because the space around it had been shaped to make it move. That motion was not chaotic. It was intentional. It began the path. By the time the Maya inherited the remnants of Olmec knowledge, the launch had long since passed into deep time. But the structure remained. So did its symbolism. So did the memory of its purpose, encoded not in language but in geometry, alignment, and myth. The Maya did not build the sphere, but they inherited its absence. They recognized that something had been sent, something tied to time, to sky, to cycles, and from that recognition came the calendar. Not a schedule of endings, but a countdown to reappearance. What modern culture misread as the 2012 doomsday was not a prophecy of destruction, but a signal of return. The Maya preserved the logic of the launch not through mechanism, but through interpretation. They understood that something had been set in motion, that it would come back, and they timed their reckoning to that expectation. Their calendar did not predict the end of the world. It marked the moment when the world would remember what it had once set in motion. And now the object has returned, not as fire, not as disaster, but as confirmation. It fell silently. It survived entry. It bore no emblem but its shape. And in its structure, it reveals the totality of its origin. A logic encoded in form, a sphere launched by a field, aligned to a configuration, timed to a cycle, and returned to a civilization capable of interpreting not its symbol, but its method. It is not just a message from the past, it is a proof, a demonstration of capability embedded in geometry and mass. The field shows us how it moved, the calendar shows us when to expect it, the object shows us that it worked. We are not witnesses to an anomaly. We are the receivers of a completed process. The Olmecs built the field, the Maya preserved the meaning, and we are the generation for whom it reappears. It is not a story, it is not a myth, it is a closed causal system, field, vector, object, time, and it still delivers.